The last story, Trapping the Dark Entity, a chilling tale of the cold touch. Chapter 1, The First Cold Touch. David Turner leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes scanning the dimly lit office. The clock on the wall ticked away, nearing midnight. He had spent the past several hours sifting through emails, each one filled with readers' accounts of eerie encounters, ghostly apparitions, and unexplained phenomena. It was part of his routine, sorting through the strange and the unusual to find the right material for his next collection of true scary stories. However, there was nothing particularly gripping so far. The tales blended together in the usual mix of fabricated horror and half-remembered dreams. Just as he was about to call it a night, a new email popped up in his inbox, titled The Cold Touch. It came from a man named Richard Caldwell, a name unfamiliar to him. David hesitated for a moment before opening the message. He was not easily unsettled, having spent years immersed in the dark corners of human fear, but something about the title drew him in. There was a simplicity to it, a rawness that suggested a genuine story. As he began to read, his interest quickly transformed into a chill that seemed to seep from the screen and into his skin. Dear Mr. Turner, the email began, I don't know if you'll believe me or if this will make it into one of your books, but I need to share my story with someone who might understand. It's about sleep paralysis, but this isn't the usual kind. It's different, darker. It happened about 3 months ago, though the effects haven't left me. I've been experiencing these episodes where I wake up completely paralyzed, my body frozen like it's no longer my own. But it's not just that. I can feel something in the room with me. Not see it, feel it. It's a coldness that creeps over my skin like the air itself is alive and reaching out to touch me. It happens during the night, always when I'm most vulnerable, and every time, the coldness feels stronger, more aware. The email continued, detailing how Richard's episodes had begun sporadically, but were now happening with unsettling frequency. He described waking up to find himself immobile, every breath a struggle, while the sensation of a freezing hand seemed to brush across his limbs. There were nights when he swore the touch was not just on the surface, but penetrating, as if the coldness itself was seeping into his bones. David reread the email, letting the words sink in. It wasn't the first time he'd heard about sleep paralysis. It was a phenomenon that often popped up in his line of work, with people recounting tales of shadowy figures, the feeling of suffocation, and strange hallucinations. Yet there was something about Richard's account that struck a different chord. It wasn't just the fear of immobility or darkness. It was the unnerving detail about the coldness, the way it seemed almost sentient, and the specificity of how Richard described it reaching for him in the night. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to reply. Instead, he found himself opening his research files, searching for any cases that might share similarities. Over the years, he had amassed a collection of unsolved incidents, reports of strange deaths, and testimonials that went beyond conventional understanding. As he dug deeper, he noticed a pattern emerging. Scattered across different locations and time periods were stories that mentioned an unexplained chill preceding some traumatic event or a mysterious disappearance. In many cases, the victims had reported the sensation of being touched by something frigid just days before meeting a dark fate. The thought unsettled him, but his logical mind pushed the discomfort aside. He'd always been a skeptic first and a storyteller second. Yet, that night, as David prepared to leave his office, a shiver ran down his spine. He glanced around, convinced for a fleeting moment that the air had cooled significantly since he started reading the email. It was probably just his mind playing tricks on him, a result of immersing himself in yet another tale of terror. But then, why did the sensation linger even after he had shut down his computer and left the room? In the days that followed, David couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It crept into his thoughts at odd moments, as if the chill Richard had described was somehow reaching through the screen and wrapping itself around him. The drafts of his new book began to take on a darker tone, his writing influenced by Richard's account. He wove the story into his latest manuscript, carefully blending fact and fiction. But each time he returned to the work, he couldn't ignore the tension that settled in his chest. The chill in his home seemed to intensify, a subtle but undeniable presence that clung to the air. At first, he brushed it off as the changing season or an overactive imagination, a side effect of spending too much time with unsettling material. But soon, the odd sensation of cold wasn't confined to the night. It followed him from room to room, seeping into his bones like a damp fog that refused to lift. At times, he would catch himself glancing over his shoulder, convinced that he wasn't alone. His instincts told him it was irrational. There was no reason to feel watched. Yet, the sensation persisted, unshakable. One evening, as he sat in his study, the temperature seemed to drop noticeably. David rubbed his arms, trying to warm himself, but the chill remained stubbornly present. It was then that he realized the feeling wasn't just in his head. There was a tangible quality to it, as though the coldness had weight and form, pressing into the room. He tried to focus on his writing, to ignore the faint prickle running along his skin, but the words blurred together on the screen, and an inexplicable dread began to pool in the pit of his stomach. Then, it happened. It was a little past 3 in the morning when David awoke, his body heavy and unresponsive. His eyes were open, but his limbs refused to budge. He lay there, frozen in place, with his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, save for the dim light of his computer's screensaver casting faint blue hues across the walls. That's when he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of icy fingers grazing his arm. It wasn't just a draft or a trick of the mind, it was real, a touch so cold it seemed to burn. Panic surged through him, but his body would not respond. His muscles felt as if they had been cemented in place. All he could do was lie there, his breath shallow, while the invisible grip tightened around him. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Dark. David sat up in bed, his skin still tingling from the icy grip that had wrapped around his arm hours before. He hadn't been able to shake the sensation even after the paralysis faded, and a restless night followed, haunted by dark dreams and indistinct figures lurking just beyond his sight. Morning brought little relief. His thoughts remained tangled with unease as he made his way to his office, a place that no longer felt like the refuge it once was. The memory of the cold touch was not something he could dismiss as a mere figment of his imagination. It was too vivid, too real. And as he returned to Richard Caldwell's email, reading it over for what felt like the 100th time, a question burned in his mind. Could this phenomenon be something more than just a shared experience among people with sleep disorders? David had written about countless urban legends and ghost stories in his career. But this felt different, personal in a way that seemed to penetrate the boundary between his work and his reality. He needed answers, and the only person who might have them was Richard. After a quick search, he found Richard's contact information in the email signature and decided to call him. His fingers hovered over the phone's keypad for a moment before he pressed the button, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and dread as he waited for the line to connect. A few rings later, a weary voice answered, "Hello?" "Richard Caldwell?" David asked, trying to keep his tone steady. "This is David Turner. I received your email about the cold touch. I'd like to discuss your experiences in more detail if you don't mind." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a hesitant, "I didn't think you'd actually call." Richard's voice was low and strained, as if he hadn't slept in days. I wasn't sure you'd believe me. I'm not dismissing anything at this point," David replied. "In fact, I'd like to know more. You mentioned the cold touch and the sleep paralysis, but have there been any other occurrences?" Richard seemed to exhale deeply, the sound crackling through the phone. "Yes, it's not just the sleep paralysis," he said slowly. "There are other things I didn't mention in the email because I didn't know how to explain them without sounding crazy." "Try me," David urged, leaning forward in his chair, pen in hand. He could hear the nervousness in Richard's voice, and he understood the hesitation. But this was not the first time he had encountered reluctant witnesses, people afraid to share their strange encounters for fear of being labeled delusional. "It's hard to describe," Richard began, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But there are moments when I feel like I'm not alone, even when I'm by myself. It's as if there's something in the room with me, something just out of sight, like a shadow in the corner of my vision that disappears the moment I try to focus on it." He paused, then added, "And sometimes I hear whispers. Whispers? David's pen stilled on the paper, the words sending a shiver down his spine. Yes, faint, like they're coming from far away, but close enough that I can hear the tone. It's like someone murmuring, just beneath the threshold of comprehension. I can't make out the words, but I know they're there. The revelation stirred something in David's memory. There had been cases he'd come across in his research, unsolved incidents where people reported similar sensations before their deaths. The reports were scattered across different years and locations, but the descriptions were chillingly consistent. The victims had spoken of a coldness in the air, the feeling of being watched, and, in some instances, faint whispering that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And then, there was the common thread in all these cases. They had experienced the cold touch shortly before meeting their end. "Richard," David said cautiously, "have you ever heard of the echoes in the dark?" The phone went silent again, and for a moment, David thought he had lost the connection. Then Richard spoke, his voice barely audible. I think so. My grandmother used to talk about it when I was a kid. Something about a shadowy figure that would come for you if you stayed out too late. She'd say it would reach out and pull you into the darkness if it touched you." His voice wavered. "But that was just a story to scare children, wasn't it?" David's pulse quickened. The echoes in the dark had indeed been dismissed by many as nothing more than an old wives' tale, a local legend whispered among children to keep them from wandering off alone. Yet, the more he dug into the folklore, the more he found accounts eerily similar to the one Richard described. The figure was said to be an unseen entity, lurking just beyond the veil of darkness, its touch colder than death itself. According to some variations of the legend, once marked by the touch, the victim would be haunted until they met their doom. David closed the notebook, his gaze drifting to the window as a late afternoon sun struggled to pierce through a gathering layer of clouds. The chill that had settled in his home seemed to thicken with every passing hour, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the cold. Was it possible that Richard's experiences and his own were linked to something more than just shared folklore? He felt a tremor of uncertainty gnawing at the edges of his mind. The stories and research seemed to bleed into his life, crossing the line between what was real and what was merely a tale. That night, as David continued his work, he found himself increasingly distracted. He typed a few sentences, deleted them, and then typed again, unable to shake the growing sense that something was amiss. The room felt darker than usual. The shadows deepened beyond what the dim light should allow. A sound interrupted his thoughts, a faint murmur, barely perceptible, as if someone were whispering just behind him. David froze, the hair on his neck rising. He strained to hear it, but the sound was so low it was impossible to catch any distinct words. He glanced over his shoulder, finding nothing but the empty room and the darkened corners. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as nothing more than fatigue playing tricks on him. Yet, the whispering grew louder, swirling around the room as if carried on a cold draft. It seemed to emanate from all directions, surrounding him with a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. His pulse quickened, a wave of dread washing over him as the whispers closed in, their voices mingling with the darkness that seemed to thicken with every breath he took. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers fell silent, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. But the sensation that lingered in the air, that frigid, creeping touch, reminded David that whatever haunted Richard might now be haunting him as well. Chapter 3: The Reader's Curse. Richard's messages had begun arriving with unsettling regularity, each more frantic than the last. At first, David received the occasional email recounting small disturbances, doors creaking open, shadows shifting across the walls when Richard was sure he was alone. But over the past week, the tone of his emails had taken a darker turn, filled with disjointed sentences and desperate pleas for help. The incidents seemed to have grown more frequent, more aggressive, and Richard's fear now bled through every word. David read over the latest email again, the words swimming before his eyes as if they were ink bleeding through paper. "It's getting closer. I can feel it watching me. Last night, I swear I saw a shape in the corner. It didn't move, just stared. I think it's angry because I told you. Please, you have to help me." The The notion unsettled David more than he cared to admit. He had read countless first-hand accounts of strange encounters, but Richard's words held a rawness that was difficult to dismiss. David had long considered himself a rational man, but as the days passed, he found himself caught in a tug-of-war between skepticism and something darker. A growing conviction that Richard's fear was not without reason. The whispers in his own home had faded, but the coldness in the air remained, like the aftermath of an unseen presence that had lingered too long. It wasn't just the chill, though. His senses seemed heightened in a way that defied explanation. The creaks and groans of the old house no longer blended into the background as they once did. Each sound felt pronounced, deliberate, as though the house itself had become aware of him. He told himself it was the result of too many hours spent immersed in Richard's experiences, that it was only natural for his mind to play tricks. But the way his daughter Emily started reacting to the house made it difficult to cling to that explanation. "Dad," she said one afternoon, her small face pale as she wandered into his study. "Why is it so cold in the living room? And why does it sound like someone's whispering?" David's stomach tightened. He turned in his chair to face her, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's an old house, sweetheart. Sometimes it makes funny noises, and the heating isn't always perfect," he replied, though he could see from her expression that she wasn't convinced. "But it's different," Emily insisted, her voice trembling. "I heard someone call my name. I thought it was you, but you weren't there." A prickle ran down David's spine. He knelt in front of her, holding her gaze. "Listen, Emily, if you ever feel scared, you come straight to me, okay? You don't have to be alone." She nodded slowly, but the doubt in her eyes remained. As she walked back to her room, David found himself staring at the empty hallway, a strange heaviness pressing against his chest. The feeling of being watched, of not being alone in his own home, grew stronger with each passing day. Richard's emails had begun to spiral into frantic paranoia. His latest message contained only a few hastily typed words. "It's here. It knows I'm talking to you. I need to stop. I don't think it'll let me." And then, nothing. For days, David heard nothing from Richard until late one night when his phone buzzed with a new voicemail. He listened to the message, Richard's voice crackling with a mixture of terror and despair. "David, I think I made it angry. It's been following me. It's getting closer every night. I saw it. I finally saw it." There was a gasp, followed by a muffled thud as though the phone had been dropped. Then came the final, trembling words, spoken in a panicked rush. "It's in the room with me now. Oh God, it's right behind me." The line went dead. David's hand trembled as he lowered the phone, the last echoes of Richard's voice still hanging in the air like a grim reminder of something he could no longer ignore. He replayed the voicemail, listening to the sounds in the background, the faint rustling, the stuttered breathing, trying to discern any detail that might explain what had happened. But all that remained was an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadowy figure Richard claimed to have seen haunted David's thoughts, and now it seemed that figure had crossed the threshold from Richard's life into his own. He could no longer shake the feeling that something was following him. During the day, it was a fleeting sense, like a chill on the nape of his neck. But at night, the presence grew bolder. He would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of his eyes, only to turn and find nothing there. The temperature in his home continued to dip, the cold seeping into the walls like a persistent fog. Desperate for answers, David returned to the notes he had compiled over the past few weeks, tracing the connections between Richard's experiences and the old cases he had researched. The pattern was disturbingly clear. Every individual who reported the cold touch, the whispers, the dark shape had soon after vanished or died under mysterious circumstances. The official records offered little explanation. Cause of death listed as accidents, suicides, or simply unexplained natural causes. But David saw the common thread woven through them all, a silent harbinger of doom, the entity. He began questioning whether his decision to engage with Richard's story had invited the entity's attention. Had his involvement somehow allowed it to breach the barrier between stories and reality? It was a thought he had always dismissed as the stuff of fiction, until now. Emily's unease only deepened his fears. The previous night she had woken up screaming, insisting that a cold hand had touched her shoulder while she slept. "Daddy, it felt real," she whispered, her voice trembling as he comforted her. "I was awake. It wasn't a dream." The words struck him like a blow, and though he kept his expression calm, his thoughts churned with a growing realization. The entity had made its presence known to his daughter. It was no longer content to linger in the periphery. It was getting closer, just as it had with Richard. The fear gnawing at the edges of his mind refused to be quieted. He decided to call Richard again, though part of him dreaded what he might hear on the other end. When the line connected, a robotic voice announced that the number was no longer in service. David's heart sank. It was as though Richard had been erased, leaving only his frantic voicemails and emails as evidence that he had ever existed. Yet, David couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that the entity had somehow silenced him, perhaps permanently. And now, it seemed to have set its sights on David's own life, creeping ever closer, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Chapter 4. The Haunting Clues. The drive to Richard's last known address took David far from the city, through narrow roads that twisted like veins across the bleak landscape. The house stood at the end of a gravel path, isolated among scraggly trees and overgrown grass. As David approached, he felt an unsettling sense of anticipation, a quiet certainty that whatever had taken Richard might still be lingering. The house itself was in a state of neglect. The front door hung slightly ajar, the wood cracked and peeling. It creaked loudly when David pushed it open, the sound echoing into the emptiness beyond. He stepped inside and was immediately struck by the chaos. Furniture lay overturned, shattered glass littered the floor, and deep scratches marred the walls, as though someone or something had thrashed about in a frantic struggle. David's breath misted in the frigid air as he cautiously navigated the disarray. The whole place was unnervingly cold, far colder than it should have been for a house that had only been abandoned for a short time. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that something unseen was watching him, lurking in the shadows. As he searched the rooms, his attention was drawn to a desk in what appeared to be Richard's study. Amidst the clutter of papers and books scattered across it lay a weathered journal, its cover worn and stained. David picked it up, a shiver coursing through him as he opened it to the first page. The entries were erratic, some written in hurried scrawls, others in trembling handwriting. They spoke of the same cold touch Richard had described in his emails, but there were far more details here. Mentions of the entity appearing closer and more frequently, and of its chilling presence pressing in from all sides. What unsettled David most, however, were the drawings. Crude, unsettling sketches of a shadowy figure, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow him as he turned each page. Several pages later, David found notes referencing obscure articles from old newspapers and passages from aged, musty books, all of which seemed connected to deaths stretching back decades. Each case bore a disturbing similarity to Richard's experiences. The victims had all reported the sensation of icy hands upon them before their untimely ends, and the phrase, "the cold touch," appeared repeatedly in their testimonies. David combed through the journal's contents for more clues, and eventually, he found an address scribbled hastily in the margins, along with the words, "Where it all began." The cryptic question hung in the air like a challenge, urging him to dig deeper. But before he could entertain the thought of visiting that place, he needed to understand what Richard had been researching. It was clear now that whatever haunted Richard had a history far older than either of them had realized. Determined to uncover the truth, David began gathering the materials Richard had referenced. Old newspaper clippings, dusty tomes with yellowed pages, and photographs of the alleged victims lay spread out before him. The faces in the photos bore similar expressions of terror and confusion, as though they had glimpsed something beyond human comprehension. As he read through the accounts, a disturbing pattern emerged. The incidents seemed to occur in clusters, almost as though the entity followed a cycle, claiming new victims every few decades before fading into obscurity, only to reappear later. The deeper David delved, the more convinced he became that Richard had stumbled upon something truly malevolent, a force that had plagued the region for generations. And now, by involving himself, David feared he had become the entity's next target. He could feel its presence growing more palpable with each passing day, a silent observer lying in wait. The room seemed to darken around him as he pored over the evidence, his concentration broken only by the deepening cold that seeped into his bones. He glanced at the small space heater he had brought with him, now inexplicably dead despite a full battery. The temperature continued to drop, and David could see his breath fogging the air in front of him. As he gathered the last of Richard's notes and prepared to leave, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over him. He paused, staring at the narrow hallway leading to the front door, where shadows seemed to gather and shift. It was then that he felt it, an all-too-familiar sensation. The weight pressing down on his chest, the tightening of his muscles, the paralyzing inability to move. The sleep paralysis gripped him fiercely, holding him in place as if unseen hands had clamped down on his limbs. His mind raced, panic welling up as his eyes darted around the room, trying to detect any sign of the entity. Then he felt it, a touch so cold it burned, creeping up from the base of his spine, moving deliberately along his neck. It wasn't merely a chill, it was a presence, unmistakable and suffocating. Icy fingers wrapped around his throat and he struggled to breathe, his lungs straining against the pressure. His vision began to blur, darkening at the edges. And just as he thought he would lose consciousness, the sensation abruptly released him. He stumbled back, gasping for air, the room returning to its former stillness. The oppressive weight lifted, but the lingering cold remained, clinging to the walls like an unwelcome guest. David staggered out of the house, his heart pounding in his ears, feeling as though he had just escaped from some unseen predator. He glanced back at the darkened windows, half expecting to see a figure watching him from within. But there was nothing there, only the silence and the creeping cold that had followed him from inside. The experience left no doubt in his mind that the entity was real, and it was growing stronger. It was not satisfied with merely lurking at the edges of his awareness. It wanted more. Whatever Richard had uncovered had awakened something ancient and malignant, and now that malevolent force had set its sights on David. He realized that if he was to survive, he needed to understand what he was truly dealing with, before the cold touch claimed him too. Chapter 5. The darkness draws near. The days blurred into restless nights as David's world darkened, the shadows in his house growing thicker, more oppressive. Sleep, once a refuge, had become an ordeal. Each night he lay in bed with a knot of anxiety tightening in his gut, the anticipation of the inevitable torment keeping him awake. When exhaustion finally overtook him, his dreams plunged him into a world of darkness where a shrouded figure loomed, stretching out hands that seemed to absorb the light around them, leaving nothing but void. The haunting no longer felt confined to the night. Even during the day, David sensed the coldness lurking just out of sight. Rooms that once felt warm and familiar now seemed alien, drained of life and color. There were moments when he'd catch a glimpse of something, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision, but when he turned to confront it, nothing was there. Yet, the feeling lingered, as if the darkness itself had taken on a presence, watching him with a malevolent hunger. Emily noticed the changes in her father. His eyes had lost their usual sparkle, replaced by a haunted look that deepened with each passing day. She could see how hard he was trying to keep it together, but his skin had grown pale, and his voice carried a weary rasp. Worried, she decided to take matters into her own hands. It wasn't just about helping her father. She needed answers for herself. Her research began at the local library, where she pored over dusty records, old maps, and any historical texts that mentioned the cold touch. The phrase yielded little information until Emily stumbled upon an obscure reference in a book about local folklore. The author had described an infamous mansion that had once stood on the outskirts of town, a sprawling estate known for its eerie reputation and strange occurrences. The place was long gone, reduced to rubble after a fire decades earlier, but its history remained shrouded in mystery. The mansion had belonged to a reclusive landowner named Edgar Alistair, a man rumored to have delved into forbidden practices, seeking to prolong his life by any means necessary. Some whispered that he had performed dark rituals in the bowels of his home, sacrificing the innocent to an unknown force in exchange for immortality. Though Alistair had perished in the flames, tales persisted of his spirit haunting the grounds, the icy touch of his presence afflicting anyone who ventured too close. Intrigued and disturbed by the mansion's history, Emily shared her findings with her father. As she spoke, David's expression hardened, his jaw tightening with a mixture of fear and resignation. He couldn't dismiss the parallels between the old tales and his recent experiences. The more they pieced together, the clearer it became that they were dealing with something far older than they had initially thought. A malevolent force that had plagued this town for generations. It seemed to follow a pattern, a cyclical return that brought suffering with it each time. David and Emily spent hours poring over the details, tracing a timeline of the reported cases. Every few decades, a cluster of deaths would occur, all preceded by stories of sleep paralysis and an icy, lingering touch. Those who acknowledged its existence, who spoke of it or wrote about it, seemed to become its next victims, as if the mere act of recognition strengthened its hold. The entity thrived on fear, marking each new target like a hunter tracking wounded prey. Realization dawned slowly, like the unfurling of a dreadful truth. As they connected the dots, David felt his stomach twist with guilt and dread. His books, the very stories that had earned him fame, had not merely documented the strange and the terrifying, they had potentially spread the curse. In his zeal to uncover and share these mysteries, he may have inadvertently provided the entity with new prey. By exposing countless readers to the cold touch, he had set the stage for the darkness to extend its reach, feeding on the fears of those who consumed his tales. And now, it was not just him at risk. Emily had become involved, her very curiosity pulling her into the entity's orbit. The more they learned, the deeper they seemed to fall into its grasp. David's hand trembled as he placed the latest set of notes on the table, his thoughts spiraling into a terrifying conclusion. Was it possible that the entity had latched onto him because of his writing? Had he, in his search for the macabre, unwittingly invited the darkness into his own life? The idea clawed at his mind, a gnawing horror that gripped him tighter than any of the entity's cold touches. Emily noticed her father's silence and reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Dad, we can't give up. There has to be a way to stop this," she said, her voice a quiet but determined whisper. But even as she spoke, her own unease was palpable, an unspoken understanding passing between them that they were facing something far beyond their control. The temperature in the room plummeted, and both of them felt it, the sudden, suffocating chill that seemed to drain the warmth from the air itself. David turned his gaze towards the darkened hallway, his pulse quickening as the shadows at the far end seemed to shift. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something sinister lingered just out of sight, drawing nearer with every breath. That night, sleep came fitfully to David, each restless turn in bed accompanied by the gnawing sensation that he was no longer alone in his own home. The darkness around him seemed alive, thick with the presence of something that lay in wait. When his eyes finally closed, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. In them, he stood before the ruins of the old mansion, the charred remains looming like jagged teeth. From the depths of the darkness, a figure emerged, its form barely distinguishable except for the glint of hollow, hungry eyes. He awoke with a start, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding against his ribs. But the terror didn't subside. Even in the waking world, the line between dream and reality was becoming disturbingly thin. He could still feel the frigid touch on his skin, could almost hear the faint whisper of his name carried on the air. As David sat up in bed, trying to steady his breathing, a dreadful certainty settled over him. He and Emily were not merely investigating a legend, they were caught in its grip, part of a living nightmare that threatened to consume them both. And somewhere, beyond the reach of light, the darkness waited, its hunger growing ever more insistent. The next step would be clear. They had to uncover a way to sever the entity's hold, to end the curse that had ensnared them. But with each passing day, David couldn't escape the feeling that time was running out, that the cold touch was drawing closer, and when it finally reached them, there would be no escape. Chapter 6, The Last Story. The days leading up to David's decision to confront the entity were a blur of dread and urgency. The darkness had grown bolder, its presence more palpable, as if it sensed that the endgame was near. David could feel the weight of its gaze wherever he went, an oppressive chill that followed him from room to room. Even Emily, who did her best to remain strong, couldn't hide the fear that had taken root in her eyes. The cold seemed to seep into the very walls of the house, turning their home into a shadowy prison. David knew he couldn't allow the entity to continue tormenting them. It had to end, one way or another. The stories he'd written had somehow opened a doorway to this malevolent force, and now he would use his writing to close it. He would confront the darkness, not with weapons or rituals, but with the very thing that had drawn it to him in the first place, a story. He locked himself in his study, the one place where he'd always felt a semblance of control. His desk was cluttered with old manuscripts, loose pages, and stacks of research material that now seemed to mock him with their irrelevance. None of the knowledge he'd gained from his countless investigations had prepared him for this moment. Yet, he was determined to try something that went against every instinct of self-preservation. He would write the entity's demise into existence. Sitting down at his desk, David pulled out a blank sheet of paper and picked up his pen. He took a deep breath, letting the silence of the room envelop him. The air was cold, colder than it had ever been, and as he began to write, he could feel the chill tightening around him like an unseen hand. He started with the beginning, a story about a man who had unwittingly summoned an ancient darkness into his life. The words flowed from him in a frantic rush, every line etched with the desperate hope that this would be enough. He poured all of his terror and despair into the narrative, shaping a tale where the entity was bound, sealed away by the power of the written word. He wrote about a final confrontation, where the man stood against the darkness, not as a victim, but as its captor, wielding the story itself as a weapon. As the sentences filled the page, David felt the temperature drop even more. It was as if the very essence of the entity was being drawn into the words. The chill intensified, sinking into his bones, and his breath became visible in the air. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to thicken, congealing into a shape that was more solid, more real. He dared not look away from his writing, but he could sense the darkness gathering, a silhouette that pulsed with a malevolent hunger. The pen shook in his hand, but David forced himself to keep going, his fingers stiff and numb from the cold. The darkness seemed to inch closer with every word, until he could hear it whispering, a voice that slid into his mind like icy daggers. "You think you can trap me?" it murmured, its tone dripping with malice. "You are mine, and your daughter will follow." The words clawed at his resolve, threatening to unravel the fragile focus he clung to. But David didn't falter. He wrote faster, the lines blurring together as his heart pounded in his chest. His narrative reached the climax, the moment when the entity would be sealed within the pages of the story forever. His hand cramped from the relentless writing, but he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that this was their last chance. The air grew impossibly cold, and David's breath came in shallow gasps. The entity was no longer a distant whisper. It was here, a tangible darkness hovering just behind him, its presence suffocating. He could feel its icy breath on the back of his neck, could hear the faintest rustle of movement as it reached out toward him. His skin prickled, and then he felt it, a touch so cold it burned, like fingers made of frost closing around his throat. For a moment, panic gripped him, and his vision blurred. The pen slipped from his hand, clattering to the desk, and he struggled to draw in a breath. The darkness seemed to pour over him, a suffocating blanket of ice. It whispered again, more forcefully this time. "You cannot escape me." With all the strength he had left, David forced his trembling hand to pick up the pen again. His fingers felt like they were encased in ice, but he managed to scrawl the last few lines. As the final word took shape on the page, a sudden, violent shudder ran through the room. The darkness recoiled, as if being sucked into a void. The coldness that had gripped him loosened, and the pressure in the air seemed to lift. The entity's shape distorted, the dark silhouette unraveling as though being pulled apart by invisible threads. It gave a low, guttural growl that resonated with fury and despair. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The The shadows dissipated, the air warmed, and the study fell silent. David collapsed against the desk, his entire body trembling from the ordeal. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest burning from the effort. He glanced down at the page before him, the ink still fresh, the story complete. It felt different from his other works, more than just a tale. It was a prison, a trap woven from his words and the entity's own malevolence. When Emily found him some time later, he was unconscious but alive, slumped over the desk. She shook him gently, her voice trembling with concern. "Dad, wake up!" she cried, her panic rising when he didn't respond at first. Finally, David stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. He looked up at her with eyes that were weary but relieved. "It's over," he whispered hoarsely. I think I did it." Emily glanced at the last manuscript, lying atop a pile of scattered papers. She could feel a faint chill radiating from it, but it was different now, contained. Whatever darkness had once roamed freely seemed to have been drawn into the pages, bound within the words. David knew he couldn't let anyone read the story. The risk was too great, the consequences too dire. He carefully wrapped the manuscript in an old cloth and placed it inside a locked drawer. It would remain a secret, a final chapter never to be published, sealed away where no one could stumble upon it by accident. As weeks turned into months, the memory of those harrowing days began to fade, though never entirely. David still struggled with sleep, haunted by the occasional echo of the entity's voice in his dreams. Emily remained watchful, her curiosity tempered by the knowledge of what had nearly been unleashed. And in the quiet of his study, the locked drawer sat untouched, its contents waiting. For though the darkness seemed to have vanished, a faint chill still lingered in the air, a reminder that some stories do not end, but merely lie in wait. Years later, a young collector stumbled upon an old estate sale and came across a stack of forgotten manuscripts. Among them was one, yellowed with age and bound in an unfamiliar cloth. Intrigued, he opened the first page, unaware of the chill that began to creep into the room, or the darkness that stirred within the words. As he read the first line, a whisper seemed to rise from the pages, faint but unmistakable. "You cannot escape me.